There is a photograph sitting on the second shelf of my study that I find myself looking at more often lately. It was taken at a company picnic in the late 1970s, back when I was working in educational publishing. Everyone in the picture is smiling, holding paper plates loaded with hot dogs and potato salad, completely unaware of what the next 4 decades would bring. I was sitting in my leather chair last month looking at that faded photo when I opened a local newspaper and read an obituary for the son of one of the men standing next to me in that picture. The young man was 34 years old. When I was 34, growing up in Ohio, the only people we knew who faced severe, life-threatening cellular diagnoses in their digestive tracts were men my father's age. It was considered an absolute, undeniable rule of getting older, a distant threat that belonged exclusively to the elderly. But as I sat there looking at the printed date of birth, I realized the rules I grew up believing were completely wrong. My daughter Rebecca, who works in nutrition, had been trying to tell me this for years. She would sit at our kitchen table, sipping her tea, and gently point out that the rates of severe digestive diagnoses in people under 50 have skyrocketed by 50% over the last few decades. I used to brush it off, thinking it was just statistics or better diagnostic tools. But seeing that young man's name on the page forced me to stop ignoring what was happening. If the environment we have built is breaking down the bodies of people in the absolute prime of their lives, I had to ask myself what it was doing to me at 77. I always assumed my health was a lottery ticket printed with my family's genetic code. My father was a proud, silent man who ignored every ache, every sign of fatigue, until his body simply quit on him. I assumed I would inherit his timeline and his fate. But when I retreated into my study and started pulling medical journals, trying to understand what was shifting in the world, the numbers I found dismantled my entire belief system. The clinical records I read showed that a very small fraction, maybe 10 to 15%, of these cases are purely driven by inherited genetics. The vast, overwhelming majority are the direct result of our environment colliding with our biology. We are living in a world of manufactured convenience, and that convenience is quietly dismantling our internal defenses. I realized that the processed deli meats I used to eat every single day for lunch, the long hours I spent sitting perfectly still at a publishing desk, the bacon we kept for Sunday mornings, all of it was creating a low-grade fire inside my digestive tract. I read how the chemical compounds in those cured meats park in the lower intestine for hours and create an inflammatory environment that overwhelms the body's natural cellular repair mechanisms. I had spent decades punishing my own biology without even knowing it, assuming that a lack of symptoms meant I was in perfect health. The journals I was reading described something that happens inside all of us, every single day, and it terrified me until I finally understood it. Right now, at this exact second, there are microscopic clusters of confused, abnormal cells forming inside my body. With 40 trillion cells constantly replacing themselves and dividing, copying errors are a biological certainty. For a long time, I thought getting sick meant you suddenly developed these cells out of nowhere. The truth I found is that we are constantly developing them. But we have a quiet, elite security force patrolling our bloodstream 24 hours a day. Specialized immune cells that act like guards, walking the hallways of our tissues, checking the locks, examining every structure. When they find a cluster of cells that have forgotten how to behave, they quietly dismantle them. We never feel a thing. It is a miracle of internal engineering. But when I read what happens when we sit still for 10 hours a day, when we consume heavily processed chemicals, when we let our internal environment deteriorate, I felt a deep ache of regret. We weaken the guards. We put our own security force to sleep through sheer biological neglect. And those microscopic clusters are allowed to slip past the perimeter, completely undetected. What I found next was the most disturbing mechanism of all. But it also became the exact thing that gave me my power back. I learned about a physical limitation. When one of those abnormal clusters escapes the security guards, it is still relatively harmless. It can only grow to the size of the very tip of a ballpoint pen. It hits a physical wall at 2 or 3 millimeters because it has no supply lines. It has no blood vessels to bring it oxygen and nutrients. It just sits there, frozen and starving. But these confused cells are incredibly manipulative. I read how they release chemical signals, essentially begging the body to build new blood vessels toward them. The clinical term I had to learn was angiogenesis. The body normally regulates this perfectly, building vessels to heal a cut and stopping when the job is done. But if those rogue cells manage to hijack the system, if they trick the body into connecting a blood supply, everything changes. The laboratory measurements I read showed that once those supply lines connect, that tiny, harmless speck can explode to 16,000 times its original size in just 14 days. 16,000 times. That number kept me awake for 3 nights. I realized that keeping those supply lines shut off was the absolute difference between aging quietly and facing a terrifying diagnosis. I am telling you this because I spent decades completely blind to the silent battles being fought inside my own chest and stomach. And I deeply wish someone had sat me down in a quiet room and explained the rules of engagement to me earlier. It took me decades to piece this together, mostly because I was too stubborn to look earlier. If you feel that this is the kind of careful, honest conversation you want to be a part of, I would ask you to take a brief second and check if you are subscribed to the channel. Many folks who sit down with me for these videos every week aren't, and doing so helps me ensure this reaches the people who might be sitting in their own living rooms right now, needing to hear exactly this. When I started looking into how modern medicine addresses this when it gets out of control, I stumbled into a research paper from a major cancer center in France that fundamentally changed how I view my morning meals. I was reading about a revolutionary approach called immunotherapy. Instead of pouring harsh chemicals into the body to burn everything down, this treatment strips the invisibility cloaks off the abnormal cells, so our own immune system can see them and destroy them. The records showed it taking people from the most severe, advanced stages and bringing them all the way back to zero. It sounded like magic, but there was a catch that completely fascinated me. It didn't work for everyone. The French researchers spent years trying to figure out why some patients experienced miraculous recoveries while others saw no change at all. They looked at age, genetics, previous treatments, everything, and they found exactly one significant difference. The answer was not in their DNA. It was in their gut. The people who responded beautifully to the treatment had high populations of one specific microscopic strain of bacteria living in the mucus lining of their intestines. I had to write the name down in my notebook to remember it. Akkermansia muciniphila. The people who did not have this bacteria did not respond to the treatment. It was that simple and that profound. The researchers even proved that if they introduced this bacteria to an environment that lacked it, the immune system suddenly woke up and started fighting. I sat in my chair and stared out the window for a long time after reading that. A microscopic organism living in the digestive tract was the key that unlocked the most advanced medical treatment in the world. And the most terrifying part is that a single round of common antibiotics can wipe that bacteria out completely. I realized that if I wanted my immune system to be primed, I had to stop thinking about feeding myself and start thinking about feeding the microscopic guardians that keep me alive. I didn't want vague advice. I wanted the exact protocols the researchers were using to block those rogue supply lines and feed that critical bacteria. The first change I made was the hardest but the most necessary. I had to dramatically increase my fiber. Not the chalky powders from the pharmacy, but the dense structural fiber from Whole Foods. I read a landmark study tracking patients with severe cellular diagnoses. For every 5 to 6 grams of dietary fiber they added to their daily intake, their survival outcomes improved by 30%. I was probably eating 10 grams a day for most of my life. The baseline requirement I found in the clinical notes was closer to 30. I started buying bags of dried beans, black beans, lentils, chickpeas. Eleanor watched me soak them overnight, completely bewildered by my sudden interest in the pantry. Now I eat a cup of cooked beans almost every single day. I mix them into soups, I put them over brown rice, I add them to salads. It was uncomfortable for my digestive system for the first 2 weeks, but as my internal environment adapted, the discomfort vanished. I know that half a cup of those beans is delivering the exact structural material my gut bacteria need to multiply, while also speeding up the transit time in my digestive tract so nothing harmful sits there for too long. The second thing I brought into my daily routine was purely focused on feeding that specific guardian bacteria in my gut. The clinical trials showed that this bacteria thrives on a very specific compound found in dark, rich fruits. The scientific name I read was elagitannins. I read that consuming just 8 ounces of pure pomegranate juice a day could multiply the population of that guardian bacteria by 6 times in just 3 weeks. So I went to the store and found the bottles of pure, dark red pomegranate juice. I am very careful to read the label to ensure no apple juice or cane sugar has been mixed in to cheapen it. It is incredibly tart. Every afternoon I pour half a glass of the juice and cut it with water. I drink it slowly. I also started keeping a bowl of walnuts on my desk, eating a handful while I read, because the skin of the walnut provides the exact same feeding mechanism for the bacteria. I even learned to add a small sprinkle of dried chili flakes to my warm meals. As the researchers noted, it surprisingly supports the exact same bacterial growth. Then I had to address the supply lines. I needed to know how to keep those abnormal cells starved of blood vessels. Pharmaceutical companies spend billions designing drugs to block these vessels, but the laboratory assays showed that certain foods accomplish the exact same blocking mechanism. The most potent one they found was green tea. The specific compounds in the tea leaves, the catechins, act as a chemical stop sign for new blood vessels. I read a massive population study tracking nearly 70,000 women over 10 years. The ones who drank green tea regularly had a massive reduction in severe digestive diagnoses. But I learned I had to prepare it correctly. I used to boil water and pour it over the leaves, effectively burning the fragile compounds away. Now I heat the water until it is just steaming, around 175 degrees. I let the leaves steep for a full 5 minutes to extract the compounds properly. I drink 3 cups a day. I never add milk because the proteins in dairy bind to the protective compounds and render them useless. Sometimes I add a squeeze of lemon juice, which actually increases the absorption. I also found that my morning coffee, which I refuse to give up, actually contains chlorogenic acid that provides a similar protective effect when kept to 2 or 3 cups a day. I also completely changed how I look at the produce aisle. I started buying dark berries, strawberries, raspberries, blackberries, and blueberries. The deep pigments in their skins contain polyphenols that starve abnormal cells. I eat a cup of them every morning, and I make sure to rotate the types I buy because each color provides a different protective compound that works in synergy with the others. But the most significant shift was learning about broccoli sprouts. My son Daniel thought I was taking up a strange hobby when he saw the glass jars on my kitchen counter. I had read that 3-day-old broccoli sprouts contain 100 times more of a powerful, cancer-starving compound called sulforaphane than the fully grown broccoli crowns I had been eating my whole life. 100 times. I couldn't ignore that math. Instead of buying mature broccoli, I buy bags of seeds. I soak a spoonful in a jar, rinse them twice a day, and within 4 days I have a dense tangle of white stems and green leaves. I put a small handful on whatever I eat for lunch, 4 times a week. I make sure to chew them thoroughly because the physical crushing of the sprout is what activates the protective chemical. If I can't grow the sprouts, I buy mature broccoli, but I strictly eat the stems, lightly steamed for 3 minutes, never boiled, because the heat of boiling completely destroys the medicine. I also had to unlearn a deeply ingrained fear about soy. For years I avoided it, believing the persistent rumors that the plant compounds acted like dangerous hormones in the body. The research I found proved the exact opposite. The compounds in whole soy actually block the human receptors that feed abnormal growth, and they are one of the most potent inhibitors of rogue blood vessels ever tested in a laboratory. I don't buy the highly processed soy powders or isolated proteins. I buy the whole food forms, edamame, tempeh, or traditional tofu. I have it twice a week now, usually pan-seared in a little olive oil. Speaking of olive oil, I keep a bottle of the highest quality extra virgin olive oil I can find right on the counter. The specific compounds in it actively reduce the inflammatory static in the body. I take 2 tablespoons a day, sometimes just on a spoon if I am not having a salad. When I cook tomatoes, I always use olive oil because the protective compound in the tomato, lycopene, is only fully released when it is heated and bound to a fat. The final piece of the puzzle was the fats I was consuming. I had to shift away from the heavy animal fats I grew up on and look toward the ocean. The omega-3 fatty acids in seafood act as a powerful anti-inflammatory blanket for the immune system. I used to think I had to eat expensive wild salmon every day, but the journals showed that even simple white fish like cod, halibut, or shellfish contain highly beneficial amounts. I make sure we have some form of seafood 3 times a week. When I can't, I make sure to grind 2 tablespoons of fresh flax seeds and put them over my morning oatmeal. I stopped relying on isolated capsules and supplements. The clinical data showed over and over again that a capsule cannot replicate the hundreds of synergistic compounds found in a whole blueberry or a whole walnut. The whole food is always more powerful. The most important lesson I took from all those hours of reading in my leather chair is that the timing and consistency of these choices matter more than anything else. The body does its heaviest repair work, its deepest immune surveillance, while we are asleep. If I eat a heavy processed meal right before bed, my body spends the night struggling to digest instead of repairing cellular damage. I make sure to eat these protective foods throughout the day, and I stop eating well before I turn off the lights. I also learned that eating a cup of beans once a week does absolutely nothing. The profound changes in the internal environment only happen when the effort is sustained. Daily green tea, daily berries, daily fiber. The body responds to the rhythm you set for it. I want to be very clear about how I view this because I have lived long enough to know the danger of false hope. If a medical professional tells you that you need an intervention, you listen. If I ever notice persistent changes in my own body, unexplained symptoms, or sudden shifts in my health, I promised myself I would not be like my father. I would not ignore it. I would go get screened immediately, without hesitation. What I am talking about is not a replacement for the profound advancements of modern medicine. It is about building an internal environment that supports those advancements, an environment where abnormal cells struggle to survive. I have read records of people combining these exact dietary changes with their conventional treatments, and the synergy between the two is what created the longest survival outcomes. You cannot control every variable in your biology. The microscopic echoes of aging are happening inside all of us right now. But you can absolutely control the environment those echoes are forced to live in. Every time I steep my tea for exactly 5 minutes, every time I add those sprouted seeds to my plate, every time I choose a handful of walnuts instead of a processed snack, I am actively closing the supply lines. I am actively arming the quiet guards that patrol my bloodstream. I am not doing this because I am terrified of aging. I am doing this because I want to be the one who stands next to Eleanor in the garden for as many years as this world will allow. I want to be a participant in my own life, not just a passenger waiting for the engine to fail. You don't need fear, you need attention. Envelhecer well starts with what you stop ignoring, but it is secured by what you deliberately choose to build every single day. I hope you will look at your own daily routine tomorrow morning and ask yourself what kind of environment you are building. Thank you for spending this time with me today. Take good care of yourself, and I will see you soon.